Hello, welcome to Ollie's Repairs. Today I will be upgrading the rear suspension and replacing the rear suspension of my 1993 VW Cabriolet. I actually ran into some difficulties in this video with the lower bolt into the shock that was seized. A very common issue in some of these vehicles that have been driven around in some environments where they put salt on the roads. Not particularly difficult to rectify, but I will be covering some of that in this video as well. Aside from that, the suspension upgrades are always very nice. I installed actually some lowering springs and some slightly performance shocks on this vehicle. Makes it ride really nice. For this repair, you'll need some metric sockets and wrenches, some pliers, hex keys, jack and jack stands, your new shocks, springs, and bump stocks, as well as I highly recommend a stainless steel lower shock bolt, then potentially some seized bolt tools such as grinders and chisels. Next, jack up the vehicle. Make sure that you don't place the jack stands on the rear beam, rather utilize the rear jack points. Those are covered in a video that I have about jacking up a cabriolet. It's linked below. Here you can see I'm supporting the rear beam with the jack. It's really critical that you support the rear beam for this repair because in step 1 we will be removing the top shock mounts and step 2 the bottom. If you don't support the rear beam, there's a chance that you can damage components on the vehicle.
Okay, we need to remove the 17mm nut. Slide your wrench on. I can grab a set of vice grips, and then you can hold the top here, and then crack that loose. All right, and carefully remove this and set it aside. Repeat the same for the other side. Hey, it's out. Okay, so we have 2 screws left, and these are the ones that mount the shock. So you can either remove it at the bottom or at the top in the trunk. I decided I'd give this a shot, but like any vehicle in the rust belt, this is going to be a gamble at best. So I got the impact out. We'll see how it goes.
For those of you that live in an area where they put salt on the roads during the winter, you'll most likely run into the issue that I had here, where this rear bolt is actually seized into the shock itself. So to fix this, I ended up removing the rear beam, but you do not have to remove it. I cut off the threaded end of the bolt, then here I'm cutting off the head of this bolt, and then I utilize an air chisel just to break the head off, and then with that same air chisel, I end up bending that rear beam open just a little bit and sliding the shock out. Next, I take a grinder and I just grind the remainder off, and then the shock can be freed from the rear beam. Again, you do not have to remove the rear beam for this. As you can see here, the reason these bolts usually seize is because inside this rubber at the bottom of the shock, you have this metal bushing that's inside the rubber, and then you put your bolt through there. And the problem is, especially here in the rust belt, salt and the water get in between there, and it rusts this bolt to this metal bushing. And then you can't get it out. And the only option you have is what you saw me do, is I cut it out, hammered it out, used a big hammer, used an air chisel, used a grinder, all of the tools. We'll be removing this upper mount here. If you bought replacement KYB rubber shock parts, then it'll include the spacer in it. But we are buying aftermarket, so we're actually just going to reuse this spacer. We also need to get this top mount right here. The way to do that, just grab a 17mm and a vice grip. And it can be loosened. All right, I know some of the thoughts and comments already. What am I doing loosening this screw? This spring's gonna shoot out. That is absolutely correct. But these are the rear springs, so there's going to be very little tension that's released. I can almost pull this down by hand already. Do not do this on the front springs. You can seriously injure yourself, but on these rear ones, there's no problem doing it. Just be careful, make sure there's nothing in the way here, but it's just fine. All right, this is all the old stuff here, terribly gross. Remove this little spacer here. We can set the spring aside, we can set this aside. Acquire your top strut mount again, and then anything else that might have gone somewhere. And repeat on the second one. All right, again, same thing, be careful, it's gonna shoot a little bit. But nothing like the front ones. The front ones you can take off your head. Shock assembly is fairly straightforward. First thing I'll do is I bought these KYB rear shock bump stops. And as you can see, this thing is huge. So what I did is I cut it right here. The reason I did that is because if you can look at the original one, it's only about this long. And this shock will compress further than the original one. So I cut this a little bit shorter. And with it cut this much, it still gives it about an inch or about 2 centimeters of compression of the bump stop before the shock bottoms out. Basically, there'll still be plenty of bump stop action left if we actually do hit a big bump. So I cut this right here, throw this away, and this is the old one, we don't need that. The next thing we can do is install these spring perches. It comes with this plastic piece now, which is nice. They used to not do that. So it kind of protects your spring on the bottom there. So slide that on. Then, this is also a new piece here, this plastic piece. And it is supposed to slide over here. But the problem is, this hole is too small. So I use a wood file it out a little bit. With it filed out, slide it onto the shock. You can use a rubber mallet to tap it down just a little bit. Next step will be the bump stop. This is actually supposed to be mounted this way with this lip sitting in here. Slide it in. All right, and now we can slide it on. This doesn't have to be slid on very far. Just until we start seeing a little bit of this metal right here that doesn't have any threads cut in it, that's just fine. Then grab your new spring. I have a set of H&Rs here, some of their sport springs. These lower the car by about 1.25 inches. They make it a little firmer. It's a great spring. Then you can take, this is your top spring cover here. Slide that on. I repainted it, sandblasted, it was all rusty. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of axle grease and grease the inside of this bushing. This generally resides on the inside of your car once this is all assembled, but I still like greasing it just to make sure it doesn't get seized onto any of these components. With all that together, the next step will be just push down a little bit. This is a new nut that was included in with the shocks, or you can just reutilize the old one. Push down and tighten it until you get it started, and then you can grab a 17mm and tighten it down all the way. The last step will be to torque this to 15 foot-pounds or 20 Newton meters. We are now ready to install this on the vehicle. I know I was just outside the camera for a few parts of this repair and therefore decided to paste in this diagram of the rear suspension. On the right side you can see that these parts are which actually reside inside the vehicle, and then on the left side you can see that these pieces I actually didn't talk about. And that's because they were already welded onto the aftermarket shock. If you don't have an aftermarket shock with these welded onto it, just make sure to include them in your repair. I know that this diagram looks complicated, but it really is a pretty straightforward system. With our strut fully assembled, take your upper mount. I bought an upgraded polyurethane for that. Slide that on top. Slide your shock up in the top where it needs to go. And then slowly you can lower it so we can slide in our rear bolt down here. For the rear bolt, since I had to cut mine and do all kinds of terrible things, I bought an upgraded stainless steel here, but even though it's stainless steel, it shouldn't rust, I'm still going to give it a real nice coating of grease. And this should hopefully keep it from rusting for years to come. So take your bolt,
slide your shock in and slide your bolt right on through. Attach the nut. I'm just going to screw it hand tight.
And repeat this on the other side.
The next step will be to scoot the shock up so that it comes right through this hole. It's easiest if you have a helper on the other side guiding the other side. With it up in place, you can grab your top shock mount. I'm utilizing, again, a polyurethane here. Slide this over. Slide on this top washer. And then you can slide on this nut. I couldn't figure out a way to torque this and get a wrench on there, so what I'm going to do is just tighten it. But if you manage to figure out a way, if you have a different system here on top, it's going to be 31.5 Newton meters or 23 foot-pounds. Then don't forget your black cap that you removed, this little rubber one. Slide it back on as well.
And repeat this on the other side.
Torque this bottom nut to 45 Newton meters or 32 foot-pounds. Today we did some work replacing some rear suspension components in this vehicle. Make sure before you take it out for a ride, double check all the bolts, everything like that. You don't want to go on the street and then have some of your bolts fall out or something, and then you get stranded on the side of the road, or even worse yet, you cause damage or injury to someone. Always make sure to double check your repairs. Thanks for watching another episode of Ollie's Repairs. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and comment for more.